You're still under oath.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Blackwell, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Fowler, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I'd like to say I have a few questions for you, but I have more than a few this afternoon. Let me just start with some basic questions, just by way of sort of background of yourself as an expert witness. Do you agree that as an expert witness, you should be objective, fair, and impartial as best you can?
Yes, I would agree that that's appropriate as best you can.
Do you agree that in the background research you do to testify, that you should be thorough?
Yes,
Meaning you should do your homework before you arrive at your opinions. Fair enough?
yes,
I asked that question in part because you asked a question about Mr. Chauvin's weight, and you understand that the relevance of Mr. Chauvin's weight to this case is how much weight he was putting onto the body of George Floyd beneath him. You understand that, don't you?
yes.
You told the jury that Mr. Chauvin's weight was 140 pounds, didn't you?
That's the information that I was provided, yes,
Where did you get this information provided?
from counsel.
In the information that was provided to you, were you not told that Mr. Chauvin was wearing equipment?
That was not considered as part of the process. I would agree with you, Counselor.
Right. So, you know he is wearing equipment, though. He's a police officer at the time, right?
Absolutely.
And so you didn't factor in the weight of his equipment that was also on the body of Mr. Floyd. Is that true?
That is true.
Now, you agree that as an expert witness, you shouldn't jump to conclusions. That is, you should reach fair conclusions based upon a careful, considered analysis.
That is correct, yes.
Do you agree that you shouldn't come at this in a way that's biased? You agree with that, don't you?
Absolutely agree with that, yes.
You shouldn't cherry pick facts.
No,
You shouldn't try to confuse the jury.
correct.
Now, there's a reason I ask about that too, because you spent quite a bit of time talking about carbon monoxide. You remember that discussion, don't you?
I do indeed.
Now, just going right to the punchline on carbon monoxide that you talked about at some length, you haven't seen any data or test results that showed Mr. Floyd had a single injury from carbon monoxide. Is that true?
That is correct because it was never sent to
I
the
just simply
laboratory for
asked you
that
whether
test.
I asked you whether it was true, sir. Yes or
It
no?
is true.
Now, as you were talking about carbon monoxide, you were referring to the squad car that Mr. Floyd was near, weren't you?
Yes,
Have you ever laid eyes, I don't mean pictures, physically, on the squad car that you were referring to?
I have not.
Do you know whether it has a single exhaust or a double exhaust?
The information that I was provided, it has a double exhaust with twin exhaust pipes on each side, so it has 4 exhausts.
Right. Now, did you know the make and the model of the car?
It is a Ford Explorer Interceptor.
Is it a hybrid?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, did you see any air monitoring data that actually would give you any information as to what amount of carbon monoxide, if any, would have been in Mr. Floyd's breathing zone?
No, because it was not tested.
It was a yes or no question. You haven't seen any, have you?
I have not seen any data.
And you didn't go yourself to try to do anything akin to air monitoring, air sampling to simulate what Mr. Floyd might have been exposed to in proximity of a similar vehicle. You didn't do that, did you?
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you agree with me that there was no finding of carbon monoxide poisoning from Dr. Baker's autopsy review?
I do.
You mentioned an EPA standard of 9 parts per million on an 8-hour basis as the exposure limit for carbon monoxide. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
And you mentioned 35 parts per million, what I call a peak exposure. That is an exposure for a 1-hour time period.
That is correct, yes.
Now, you are not now, nor have you ever been an industrial hygienist, true?
Absolutely correct. I have not been.
Now, the fact that the EPA provides a standard of 9 parts per million on an 8-hour basis, that's a time-weighted average, isn't it?
Yes, that is your maximum exposure over that period, and you're allowed to do that once in 1 year.
So it's a time-weighted average over 8 hours. Are you able to tell this jury whether or not Mr. Floyd, at the time that he was being subdued on May 25th, was being exposed to carbon monoxide above the limit or level that was set by the EPA of 9 parts per million?
No, no testing was done.
For that matter, cutting even more to the chase, how do you know the car was even on?
It is a question I specifically asked, and then I made an observation of water dripping from what appears to be a tailpipe.
So if I ask you directly, do you know if in fact the car was on or not? You didn't see any information or data from anybody who says I either turned the car on or I'm the one who turned it off. You didn't see either one, did you?
Correct.
And you just simply assumed by seeing something dripping from a tailpipe that the car had to have been on.
It's not an assumption, it's an evaluation, which in my mind indicates that the vehicle was running.
You mentioned carbon monoxide studies. These are outside studies that you're referring to. Remember those outdoor studies?
They are referring to outdoor air, yes.
You referenced a total of 2 studies, true?
The carbon monoxide, which studies are you referring to?
I'm referring to the San Antonio study. I'm sorry, 3. Well, San Antonio study, the DeMaio, and then the Polis study.
So the DeMaio and San Antonio are one in the same.
Okay.
Dr. DeMaio was the chief medical examiner at the San Antonio chief medical examiner's office when he wrote that article.
So then if we have the San Antonio study and then DeMaio are one study, that one study involved 3 people, didn't it?
Correct.
And then we have the study you told us about, the Polish study, that involved 1 person, right?
Correct.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how long were the subjects in those studies exposed to carbon monoxide? Do you know?
It's unknown.
Now, I had another issue that I wanted to raise, again, under this heading of the jury not being confused. And this relates to the white substance that you were referring to in the mouth of Mr. Floyd. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
And so it started with the white substance in his mouth, and I think it ended with talking about a partially digested pill in a car. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
I'd like to show you and discuss with you a couple of exhibits. Now, you told us that you looked at surveillance video from stores in discussing the materials that you reviewed. Remember that?
Yes, sir.
And the store at issue here is Cup Foods.
That was one of them, yes.
So you recall looking at the surveillance video from Cup Foods.
Yes.
I want to review part of that video with you, if I could. And if we pull up Exhibit 29, I think it's in evidence. Just one moment, John. So I'm showing you an excerpt from Exhibit 29 and inside Cup Foods. And I want us together to observe George Floyd. Yeah, 7:41 and then 42. You can go ahead and play it, Brian. And could you zoom in, Mr. Altiste, on George Floyd and were you able to see that portion of the clip, Dr. Fowler?
Yes,
Were you able to see that George Floyd was chewing?
Overruled, if you have an opinion.
I saw his mouth open and close briefly. He could have been chewing. I don't know.
Let's play it again, because I would like for you to know.
Sustained.
It was fast, Your Honor, if I could.
Do you need to see it again to render your opinion?
From what I saw, Your Honor, it was too brief to...
See if that changes your opinion.
All right, now I want to show you a couple of stills. If, Your Honor, I made a couple of stills from this segment of the footage that I marked separately as Exhibits 812 and 813, and I would move their admission.
Any objection? 812 and 813 are received.
So if you put up 812, Brad, and could you zoom in again on George Floyd? Now, Dr. Fowler, can you see a white substance in George Floyd's mouth there?
I can.
And doesn't it look remarkably similar to the white substance that you were talking about when you were discussing the photograph with the gun pointed at him in the car when he was first approached by the police?
Yes, it looks very similar.
Is it your understanding that when Mr. Floyd left Cup Foods, he went out across the street to sit in the vehicle?
Yes.
And next he was then approached by the police sitting in the vehicle, right?
believe he was first approached by the clerks from the store, and then he was approached by the police subsequently.
So would it be fair to say, in order to say that the white substance in Mr. Floyd's mouth was a pill, in light of what you've seen, that would be jumping to a conclusion, wouldn't it?
Specifically, when I testified, I said there was a white object in his mouth. That's all I could discern from that, and I remember saying that under direct.
So you are not then either telling or suggesting to the jury that the white substance was a pill, are you?
I never said it was a pill. I carefully said that I could see a white structure in his mouth.
Dr. Fowler, if you just answer
And I did not want to classify it, and I didn't classify it.
if you just answer my question.
Yes.
You're not either telling or suggesting to the jury that the white substance was a pill, are you?
No, I never did.
One other thing, under the heading of not wanting to confuse the jury. You had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about a scientist, Dr. Ray, R-E-A-Y, and the statement you made, and you can correct me so I say it accurately, but it was to the effect that he had been critical of prone positioning and his relationship to asphyxia, but that he had later retracted that opinion. Remember discussing that?
Yes.
Now, the statement that Dr. Ray had retracted his concerns about the dangers and hazards of the prone position with respect to asphyxia, that statement was in fact never withdrawn by Dr. Ray. Isn't that the real truth?
He withdrew it and said that it was more of a risk to individuals who were obese, is my recollection of the course of events in Dr. Ray's history.
Your Honor, I want to show Exhibit 818 simply for identification purposes to discuss with the witness. So let me show you first. This is an affidavit from Dr. Ray. And if you look on the second page, if you have that, Mr. Eltis, do you see where he has signed it here and dated it? Donald Ray.
Yes.
That's the person you're referring to, right?
Yes, Dr. Donald Ray.
Let's go back to the first page and see if he retracted this. So let's see the first paragraph, just so we see what this is about. Statement written by Donald Ray and sent to Charlie Miller in June of 1998. In the November issue of the Annals of Emergency Medicine, Chan et al. Published a paper entitled Restraint Position and Positional Asphyxia. This is one of the studies that you were referencing earlier today, isn't it?
Yes.
If we go down, Brett, 2 paragraphs to the I readily acknowledge. Here, Dr. Ray is saying, I readily acknowledge the value of these studies, that is Chan studies, in the San Diego case of Price versus San Diego, which had many other features besides hog-tying in the restraint maneuvers used to control the victims. This has since been presented in law enforcement publications as my retraction of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, with particular reference to hog-tying. And let's look at the next paragraph. Here's the punchline, Dr. Fowler. Such is not the case. I still maintain that there are risks and hazards. I'm reading what it says, right?
Well, the question is, what's the question?
The question is simply exploring what it is that Dr. Ray, in fact, said on the issue of whether he retracted this statement.
Well, 30 minutes to make sure there's a question after each portion as to whether it's true or not.
All right.
Mr. Blackwell, would you join us on the sidebar?
Yes, Your Honor.
So if you could re-ask the question, just so we're clear.
Yeah, sorry, Your Honor. So, Dr. Fowler, I'd like to explore with you Dr. Ray's response on the question of whether he retracted his statements of concerns about positional asphyxia as relates to the prone position. Did Dr. Ray say, as you see here, that such is not the case?
Yes, I do.
And do you see where he says, I still maintain that there are risks and hazards to restraint maneuvers, including hog-tying, and each case must be evaluated to assess the presence or absence of respiratory restriction in light of the method of restraint. Do you see that?
Yes, that's what's written in this affidavit.
And then one more point here he makes. If we can see just 2 paragraphs down, the point. He says here, do you see this? The point is that street deaths are much different than controlled investigations. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so, Dr. Fowler, does having seen this affidavit from Dr. Ray change your opinion as to whether he had retracted his opinion of concerns about positional, the prone position as relates to positional asphyxia?
So it appears that he hasn't completely withdrawn his position, but
Thank
he
you.
does go into some additional description, which is the paragraph above, which you didn't
Dr.
highlight.
Fowler, you answered my question. And if there are other things that Mr. Nelson would like to bring out, he'll have an opportunity to. Thank you, Brian. Now let's talk for just a moment about your areas of expertise. We know that you are a forensic pathologist, sir, but you're not a toxicologist, or you don't have a degree in toxicology.
That is correct. I'm not a toxicologist.
And to be clear for the jury, as a forensic pathologist, you don't treat patients.
Correct.
We have heard from a pulmonologist who's also a respiratory physiologist. You're not a pulmonologist or a respiratory physiologist. True?
That is true.
So you never measured anybody's respiration, that is their breathing, as a part of your work as a forensic pathologist.
No, I have not.
You're not a cardiologist, obviously.
No.
Just by way of just a couple of background things, you told us a good bit about your background, but what year was it that you arrived in the United States?
I believe it was 1991.
And in what year did you retire?
December 31st, 2019.
You told us quite a good bit about the forensic panel, and you're employed as a consultant by the forensic panel. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
Now, to be clear for the jurors so they're not confused, the forensic panel is not a nonprofit, is it?
No, it's not a non-profit. At least to the best of my ability, I don't know what they're classified as, frankly. I do not know.
So, through the forensic panel, you earn a livelihood, so it's not volunteer time for you, is it?
No, I get compensated by the hour.
And the forensic panel, then, is not a governmental body.
Correct, it's an independent organization.
It's a business.
It's a medical/forensic science practice, which medical practices are businesses, yes.
It's a business.
Yeah.
So I want to talk with you a bit about asphyxial deaths. It's been what we've been referring to as deaths caused by low oxygen. Do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that positional asphyxia is placing a person into a position that restricts their ability to ventilate their lungs, or a position where the head may be in such a position that you can't keep the airways open.
That is correct, yes.
And then at the end of the day, in positional asphyxia, what gets restricted is a person's ability to oxygenate their blood because of the position they're in, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Doctor, there are two component methods of ventilating the lungs. One is to move your ribs, and the other is to be able to move your diaphragm. Is that true?
That is true, yes.
But the key thing for breathing is that you'll be able to expand your chest. If you can't expand your chest, you can't breathe.
Correct. You need to expand the capacity of the chest cavity so that the lungs draw air in as part of the process.
You know, I'd like to focus with you for a moment on the first roughly 5 minutes that Mr. Floyd was on the ground as part of the subdual and the restraint under Mr. Chauvin. Did you analyze where Mr. Chauvin's knees were relative to the positioning of Mr. Floyd's body in that first 5 minutes?
I did review the positioning, yes.
Would you agree with me that for over half of that time period, Mr. Chauvin's left knee was on the neck, and his right knee is at times on the back, and at other times on his left arm, or pushed in against his left side?
That is correct. Those are all the positions that I observed the knee in, the right knee, during that period of time.
And so Mr. Floyd then is sandwiched in a way between Mr. Chauvin on top and the asphalt pavement beneath it, right?
Yes, if you...
It's a yes or no question.
Yes.
I want to ask you a question about putting pressure on someone's neck. That is, if you're on a person's back and you are applying pressure to the neck. Doctor, do you agree that if pressure is applied to somebody's neck in the prone position and the person is squeezed until they become responsive, and if that pressure is maintained for a minimum of 4 minutes, that can cause irreversible brain damage because the brain may be starved of oxygen? Is that true?
Once cessation of oxygen to the brain starts,
Dr. Fowler, my question was, is it true?
would you please restate the question?
Yes, sir. If you apply pressure to someone's neck and squeeze until the person becomes unresponsive, and you maintain that pressure for at least 4 minutes, you will cause irreversible brain damage because you will have starved the brain of oxygen. Is that true?
Correct. It takes 4 minutes of no supply of oxygen to the brain to cause irreversible brain damage.
Now, if somebody dies as a result of the consequences of insufficient oxygen or low oxygen, we know that when that person dies, they're going to die of cardiopulmonary arrest because everybody dies of cardiopulmonary arrest. Fair enough?
Yes.
And if a person dies as a result of low oxygen, that person's also going to die ultimately of a fatal arrhythmia, right?
Correct. Every one of us in this room will have a fatal arrhythmia at some point.
Right, because that's kind of how you go.
Yes.
So I want to talk about the role of sort of physical activity, struggle, if you will, on the oxygen stores or reserves when somebody may be in the prone position. Do you agree that when somebody is involved in a pretty vigorous physical confrontation, they would certainly have what's referred to as an oxygen deficit.
Yes, any kind of exertion, you build up a degree of lactic acid and other metabolites that need to be removed from the body. And the term oxygen debt is used more in the lay environment, but yes, you have some makeup to do.
And because you're using up your oxygen reserves then.
Somewhat, but it's also more generation of the metabolic byproducts from the actual activity as well.
Well, would you agree that somebody with an oxygen deficit who is involved in a vigorous physical confrontation would be more susceptible to positional asphyxia than would otherwise be the case? Do you agree with that?
Yes, it would be more difficult for them to regain their, to get rid of the metabolic byproducts of the activities that occurred before.
And would you agree then that a person with an oxygen deficit or debt is more prone to any kind of asphyxia than a person completely at rest? Do you agree with that?
Yes, a fully oxygenated person at rest would certainly be at no risk of, or not no, but a substantially lower level of risk of an arrhythmia compared to somebody who has been exercised hard.
Dr. Fowler, are you familiar with a text known as Spitz and Fisher?
Yes,
Pretty big. This is a standard text for medical examiners, isn't it?
it's certainly one of the recommended books that fellows in forensic pathology will review as part of their training, yes.
And it's one you've in the past referred to as a reliable text.
Yes.
It is handed out to all forensic pathologists in training as just a standard text.
Again, it's recommended that they use that as one of their references.
And you aware that this text on medical legal investigation of death, it contains sections on deaths by asphyxia, doesn't it?
Yes.
And do you agree that for death by positional asphyxia, that is death caused by lower insufficient oxygen, that the causes for that may be what's referred to as endless?
Yes. Hence the complexity of these particular cases.
So you spoke with Mr. Nelson about the fact that on autopsy, when somebody dies of asphyxia or insufficient oxygen, you might see injuries to the ribs or to the vertebrae that indicate the type of restraint, or at least how the asphyxia came about. You might see that, right?
Yes.
You might see what we refer to as traumatic manifestations, things like bruises, evidence of injuries on autopsy. You might see those, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that the majority of cases where somebody dies of asphyxia are very subtle, and in fact, no traumatic manifestations are visible at all?
That is correct, depending on the circumstances.
And what I mean by that is that there isn't necessarily any evidence, any physical evidence on autopsy of what it is that caused the low oxygen in the majority of cases, right?
In a substantial number of the cases, I'm not sure it's absolutely the majority.
Brett, could you skip to page 828? Dr. Fowler, can you see here from this is from Spitz and Fisher. For identification purposes, Your Honor, it's Exhibit 814 for the record. Am I reading here correctly that, however, the majority of cases are subtle, in fact, often with no traumatic manifestations at all? I read that accurately?
Yes, he did.
Thank you, Brett. Are you familiar with a publication called Knight's Forensic Pathology?
By Sir Bernard Knight, yes.
And that's another reliable authority for forensic pathologists, isn't it?
Correct.
Did you know that that Knight's Forensic Pathology also has a chapter on suffocation and asphyxia?
Yes.
That doesn't surprise you, does it?
Doesn't surprise me, and I've seen it.
And that is Exhibit 815, just for identification purposes. And I want to show you what's said at page 354. This is taken from Knight's. Knight's, it says, there are no truly distinctive autopsy signs of pure hypoxia, and most of the alleged criteria are caused by factors other than a lack of oxygen. Did I read that accurately? Dr. Fowler?
Yeah, I'm just reading it and trying to process it. I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry, no, please, take your time.
Yes, that's what it says.
Now, you had some discussions with Mr. Nelson about strangulation. You do understand in this case that no one is contending that Mr. Floyd was manually strangled by anyone. You understand that, don't you?
Oh, absolutely correct. There was no evidence of manual strangulation and no discussion of manual strangulation.
Dr. Fowler, do you agree that with respect to positional asphyxia, the diagnosis of positional asphyxia is one that is made by investigation, because you won't find an autopsy finding that necessarily, specifically tells you why the person is asphyxiated?
Correct. The scene information becomes very important.
Now, you spent quite a bit of time talking about the prone position studies, and I referenced them just a few minutes ago by Chan and others. Let me ask you a couple of other questions just about those studies and to try to correlate them to this case. Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that none of the prone restraint studies that you referred to actually studied subjects who had someone's knee on their neck in the prone position? Is that true?
That is true.
None of the studies went for as long as 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Is that true?
That is true.
So do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that if the weight of several officers or a police officer is put on the actual torso and abdominal areas of a person in police custody, that can cause compressional or positional asphyxia? Do you agree with that?
If it exceeds the limits of 225 pounds, as found by multiple studies, then yes, your argument is correct.
Could I show Brett Exhibit 808 for identification purposes? Sorry, Judge. Let me ask you first, you did give a deposition in a case that is called Curtis versus Prince George's County a few years back. Do you remember giving a deposition in a case called Curtis?
Yes.
And You've been involved in any number of depositions over your career as a forensic pathologist, haven't you, sir?
Yes, sir.
But in every one of them, you took an oath that you would tell the truth at the depositions, right?
Yes.
So with that said, let's look at your question and answer from this deposition. Question, what would it take a police officer to do in that situation to cause compressional or positional asphyxia? Well, the compressional specifically would require the weight of several officers on the actual torso and abdominal area, something that is documented in the medical literature as burking, which is a method of killing people that was made popular back in England in the Middle Ages when they were looking for bodies to teach medical students anatomy. Did I read that accurately?
Yes.
Can we agree that when you gave the answer to this question, you did not say anything about in excess of 200 pounds or 220 pounds? Is that true?
All I said would take the weight of several officers on the torso and abdominal area. That's exactly what I said there.
Sir, I just asked you if you made any reference to having a weight that exceeds either 200 or 220 pounds. Did you make any such reference, yes or no?
I didn't give a specific weight, I just said several officers.
So we know here, in this case, when Mr. Chauvin was on Mr. Floyd's back and neck, from time to time he was pressing down forcefully with his knee also on the left arm. You saw the knee on the left arm from time to time, didn't you, sir?
Yes, I did.
I want to ask you in that framework about another quote from Spitz and Fisher, Exhibit 814 for identification purposes on page 833. I'm sorry, sir. 833. Contrary to the belief of some, it is our opinion that pinning down the shoulders or forcefully pressing down the arms is equivalent to loading the back. A struggling, agitated individual breathes faster, has a faster heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and heightened metabolism. Such an individual requires more air and more oxygen. Immobilization of the chest, even if only partially reducing the ability to maintain vital functions, culminates in cardiac arrhythmia. Do you agree with the statement from Spitz and Fisher? Sure.
No, specifically, I do not. They stated it is their opinion, and again, this is a medical opinion expressed by those particular authors. It's not a scientific fact.
Thank you, Brent. Dr. Fowler, do you agree that with Mr. Floyd in a prone, stomach down position, with Mr. Chauvin applying some pressure to the neck and pressure to the torso in a downward position, that these forces would be symbiotic? They would actually add together. Is that true?
Yes, I agree. In the paper by Kroll, as I quoted earlier on, the single knee...
Dr. Fowler, I just asked if it was true.
Yes, Dr. Kroll confirmed that.
And all those things together would make somebody more likely than if those factors weren't present. It would make it more likely for them to succumb to asphyxia, correct?
If the weight is sufficient, yes.
You told us, Dr. Fowler, that you had been able to catch some of the testimony at the trial from some of the other medical persons who testified. You didn't see all of it, but you've seen some of it.
That is correct, sir, yes.
Are you then aware that a number of medical experts and others have testified that Mr. Floyd died primarily to the effects of low oxygen that arose out of Mr. Chauvin's subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Are you aware that a number of persons have testified about that?
Yes, I am.
I'd like to talk with you about what specifically you have done to actually assess what Mr. Floyd's actual oxygen reserves would have been during the subdual, restraint, and compression on May 25th of 2020 while he was underneath the body of Mr. Chauvin. You wrote a report containing your opinions in this case, and it is dated on February 22nd of 2021, right?
Yes.
I will represent to you and assume for purposes of my questions that end expiratory lung volumes, or EELV, is the amount of air that remains in your chest between breaths. Will you accept that as a premise for my questions?
The end respiratory lung volume?
Yes,
Is that
sir.
what you're referring to?
The EELV, yes.
Yes.
And I'll refer to that commonly as simply the body's oxygen reserves, just as a common way to refer to it. And
It's the air that's left in your lungs. It's not the body's oxygen reserve. Your major oxygen reserve is in the oxygen dissolved in your bloodstream.
we'll just call it the EELV then, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Do you agree that as the EELV decreases, that it takes more work to breathe?
I believe so, yes.
Incidentally, you were having a discussion, had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about the hypopharynx. You recall that discussion?
Yes.
Now, the report that you prepared in this case was 31 pages or thereabouts. Fair enough?
Yes.
Can we agree that the word hypopharynx doesn't appear in your report in any of the 31 pages expressing your opinions, does it?
That is correct.
Now, you had made some comments earlier that you couldn't find anything in the literature about whether the hypopharynx may be impeded by restraints on the back. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And I take it you went to look at forensic pathology studies in that regard, didn't you?
I searched the general literature and forensic pathology sources, yes.
Did you look actually in physiology journals, sir?
That I would consider to be part of the general medical literature.
So yes, you did look in physiology journals.
I searched broadly for it. I don't know whether it's... I did not specifically focus on look in physiology journals only.
Well, I don't want to confuse the jury now. Do you...
No.
Do you... I'm sorry, Judge.
Sidebar, please. I'm sorry, you could restate the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Fowler, I was simply trying to get a clear answer, if you can give us one. Do you have a specific recollection of actually looking at physiology journals on the question of the relationship between the hypopharynx and the ability to breathe?
I specifically did a PubMed search, which includes human physiology journals, and nothing came up on my search. So therefore I did not read any physiology journals on this because nothing came up in the search.
So, Dr. Fowler, did you calculate quantitatively and include in your report what Mr. Floyd's EELV was while he was sitting on the sidewalk before the subdual and restraint began on the ground?
No, I don't believe I did.
Did you calculate and record the amount of air he took in with each breath at any point in time, either before or during the subdual and restraint on the ground?
No.
Did you do any quantitative assessment in your report for the time while he was sitting on the sidewalk by the Dragon Walk, or whether his breathing, his EELV was either normal or whether it was abnormal?
No, I did not.
Incidentally, if his EELV was 89, that is 89 millimeters of mercury, would you agree that that would have been normal then, before the time of his subdual and restraint on the ground?
I typically do not do pulmonary medicine, so the exact ranges of human beings are not something that I classically keep in my head, so I don't know that number, Councillor.
When Mr. Floyd then was laid prone on the street, when he's face down, did you do any calculations of what any reduction may have been in his EELV due to him being placed in a prone position?
No.
When Mr. Chauvin had his knees on Mr. Floyd's back, left arm and left side, did you do any calculations quantitatively for how that weight on the back would have had any impact on his EELV?
No, I did not.
Would you agree with me then that as the EELV goes down, do you agree that as that goes down, it takes more work to breathe?
That is my understanding, but I'm not a pulmonary physician.
All right, so fair enough. For that, you would defer to a pulmonary physician.
For more detail, yes.
Let me ask you this, and you will tell me if I'm asking the wrong person, Dr. Fowler. Would you agree that pressure on the soft side of the neck also narrows the size of the upper airway, the hypopharynx?
I have not seen any literature which indicates that that happens. That was one of the specific things I searched for. Because you're correct, Councillor, it was not something that was put into the report, because it's not something that I have ever heard of. And so I then went and looked for pressure on the neck causing restriction of the hypopharynx, and my literature search was not fruitful.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. If we might show Exhibit 941 that's already in evidence. So showing you, Dr. Fowler, what has been entered in the evidence as Exhibit 941. If we look at the left picture, we can see here, and I'll represent you this Mr. Chauvin, who's on top of Mr. Floyd. You can see here Mr. Chauvin's knee on the back part of the neck in the left photograph. Can you see that, sir?
Yes.
And then on the right picture, you can see that his knee is on the side of the neck, on the soft side. Can you see that also?
Yes, on the back of the right side of the neck.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brett. And I think you referred to Mr. Floyd's death as a sudden death event. Is that the word you used?
Yes, more sudden than prolonged.
If we focus on the first 5 minutes that Mr. Floyd is restrained on the ground, you were able to see in that 5 minutes, first saw Mr. Floyd just struggling to breathe, right? Well, I'll rephrase it, John. You could see in the first 5 minutes, or hear that Mr. Floyd was first calling out that he can't breathe.
Correct. Mr. Floyd verbalized, "I can't breathe," multiple times.
And you then later heard him actually call out for his mother.
Yes.
And as time passed in that first 5 minutes, you could hear that his voice got thicker and quieter. You could hear that, couldn't you?
I did not perceive that, but I'm no better at listening than anybody else is, so anybody can make up their own opinion with regard to that.
But to your hearing, you didn't hear any change in Mr. Floyd's voice. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Not that I noticed.
Did you notice that during the 5 minutes that his words got further apart?
Yes, they did.
Did you notice that after roughly 4 minutes and 45 seconds that Mr. Floyd went unconscious?
Yes.
Then did you notice that sometime after 5 minutes, he was found not to have had a pulse?
Correct.
In your report, you refer to this as a sudden death event, but in your report and your findings, you don't record a time, do you, sir, for when the sudden death supposedly occurred, do you?
I don't specifically remember doing that. Correct.
So if we look at this continuum from hearing George Floyd calling out that he can't breathe to the point that it doesn't have a pulse over that 5 minute time period, is it fair to say that that is what you're referring to as a sudden death?
No.
All right. Then, all right, I asked you the question about when the sudden death occurred. Where in this spectrum then, it's okay if you don't know the specific time, but where in this continuum did the sudden death occur from the time he is on the ground saying he can't breathe to the point in time he's found not to have a pulse? Are you able to generally characterize where the sudden death took place?
So, what you're referring to as a sudden death, and I may well have misinterpreted, I'm referring to as a sudden cardiac arrest. There's a difference between death and cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is not absolutely irreversible and not synonymous with a person always passing away. So there's going to be a period of time between his cardiac arrest. For instance, in this particular case, the official pronouncement was done in the hospital. Frankly, he was dead long before that. But the moment of death is not something that you can easily document.
So when we are in this space where there is a space between cardiac arrest and between the actual death, are you suggesting that though Mr. Floyd may have been in cardiac arrest, there was a time when he may have been revived because he wasn't dead yet?
Immediate medical attention for a person who's gone into cardiac arrest may well reverse that process, yes.
Do you feel that Mr. Floyd should have been given immediate emergency attention to try to reverse the cardiac arrest?
As a physician, I would agree.
Are you critical of the fact that he wasn't given immediate emergency care when he went into cardiac arrest?
Yeah, as a physician, I would agree.
When you were observing the footage of Mr. Floyd after he's gone unconscious, there's a point in time where you see his legs raise up. Do you recall seeing his legs raised at the point after he was unconscious on the ground?
Yes.
Was that leg raising, was that consistent with what's known as an anoxic seizure?
That is what we would typically call it, yes.
And an anoxic seizure typically represents that there has been some damage to the brainstem due to insufficient oxygen, true?
It's anoxic, or in some cases we would call it hypoxic seizure, and it's not damage to the brainstem. It means that the part of the brain that governs our actual muscular movement, which is the higher portion of the brain, is not functioning properly. So typically people with seizure disorders who have seizure activity, it's from the motor cortex and not from down at the brainstem. If you've damaged the brainstem at that particular stage, the person is effectively going to be deceased.
So, but it's fair to say when we see an anoxic seizure, at the very least, we know that the brain is suffering from insufficient oxygen.
Yes,
Do you agree that low oxygen in the body, insufficient oxygen, it can cause brain injury, can't it?
absolutely.
And it can also result in PEA, pulseless electrical activity, true?
True.
Now, Mr. Floyd had a PEA, a pulseless electrical activity arrhythmia, when his body was taken away from the scene on May 25th, 2020, didn't he?
Correct.
Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that the most common cause of a PEA is low oxygen, insufficient oxygen?
To the brain?
Yes, sir.
Yes, which can also be caused by a cardiac standstill. So no oxygen to the brain from either mechanism will cause PEA.
I had a number of questions. I'm kind of thinking through them. I'll just ask you this. I had a number of questions that have to do with whether you did any sort of quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's oxygen levels, his EELV, at different points in time, including at what point in time do you think his oxygen stores were completely depleted? I take it, Dr. Fowler, if I have any questions about quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's EELV, those would not have been measurements that you would have undertaken for any reason, right?
Correct.
And to the extent we are looking for such measurements, better to ask either a pulmonologist, a respiratory physiologist, but not necessarily, not Dr. Fowler as a forensic pathologist. Fair enough?
Fair enough, forensic pathologists do not typically look at living people who are breathing.
By the same token, if I had a series of questions about measurements of the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body after he ceased to breathe, between the time that he ceased to breathe and before the time he was given oxygen, when he was picked up and given medical care and taken to Hennepin County Medical Center. You didn't do any quantitative analysis, did you, as to the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body in between the time he ceased to breathe and then the time he would receive assisted oxygen?
No, not specific quantitative analysis, no.
Now, you had quite a discussion about the paraganglioma. Remember that discussion?
Yes,
Do you know we had a witness who testified who refers to it as an incidentaloma? You ever heard that expression before?
yes,
Now, you talked about the paraganglioma potentially being an issue if it were secreting adrenaline, right?
correct.
90% of paragangliomas do not secrete adrenaline. Is that right? Is that right?
I think that's probably correct. I don't have that number in my head, but I have no reason to disbelieve that.
Now, you're not telling the jury, are you, sir, that Mr. Floyd died from a paraganglioma, are you?
No,
And although Dr. Baker did identify the paraganglioma on autopsy, he didn't perform any test to determine whether it was a secreting tumor, that is, secreting adrenaline, did he?
correct. The only way to test those particular tumors is there's two methods to test. One is to do a blood test, and if the paraganglionoma is one which is constantly secreting, you'll pick it up on a blood test. For those paragangliomas that tend to be cyclical, if you do a blood test and you happen to pick it up at the bottom of a cycle, it won't show. And so in some cases, the first test is to do a blood test. If it's positive, you've got your answer. If that blood test is negative, you then go on to do a 24-hour urine catecholamine screen, which will pick up the surges and the dips. And that is then, the second test that would be done in these cases. Neither of them were done.
Doctor, just for clarification, is it pronounced paraganglioma or paraganglionoma?
I often add in the extra vowel, so it's a paraganglioma. Paraganglioma, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. Now, is it true that in all the world literature, there have only been 6 reported cases of people who have died from a sudden heart event from adrenaline release from a paraganglioma? Is that true?
That's what the literature says, because in many cases it may go completely unrecognized.
I just asked if it was true, Dr.
Yes, that's
Fowler.
what's in the literature.
Now, one of the signature hallmarks for a paraganglioma is a headache, right?
If it is one that does secretion at surge and then dip and surge. So if it's one that constantly secretes a small amount, it will not cause any symptoms at all.
Right. But to the extent, we know that amongst the various complaints that Mr. Floyd had about pains, he never did complain about a headache, did he?
I seem to remember one admission where he complained of a headache, but I'm going from memory now, and I am not sure.
And here I'm referring to on May 25th of last year. You have a recollection that Mr. Floyd complained of a headache?
I know he complained of tooth pain and a few other things, but I can't be sure that he did not complain of a headache. I do not have a clear recollection, Councillor.
Right. I won't hold you to that then.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Fowler, you asked some questions about Mr. Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," before he was put on the ground during the subdual and the restraint. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
Were you able to see what was happening with Mr. Floyd as they were trying to get him into what's referred to as Squad 320?
Yes.
Were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd was experiencing being choked as he was being put into the back of Squad 320?
I did not see a limb around his neck from my recollection. That's not something that I noticed.
Your Honor and Counsel, I have a couple of stills from Exhibit 43 that's already in. And these are numbered Exhibits 281 and 282. And I would offer those stills from Exhibit 43 already in evidence.
Any objection?
281, 282, Counsel?
Yes, sir. May I, Your Honor? Just...
Yeah.
No objection.
281 and 282 are received.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we could first, Brad, if we could show 282. Can you see here in 282, this area? Do you see where I've circled, Dr. Fowler?
Yes.
And do you see this arm that is around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Do you recognize this person to be Mr. Chauvin?
It appears to be yes.
And if I could show you 281. I'm sorry, Your Honor, if you could. And here we see the top of Mr. Floyd's face. And then there's a hand here on his neck. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so you, these weren't images or scenes that you had paid special attention to before as you looked at what was going on in Squad 320? You had not seen any arms or anything around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Now, I'd seen these particular sections. I'm sorry if I misinterpreted your question. You said before he went into Squad 320. I apologize if I misinterpreted your question.
And so do you know whether when Mr. Floyd was into the back of Squad 320 and before he's pulled out, whether he complained about being choked? Did he say, "I'm getting choked"?
I believe he did, yes.
And it doesn't take a medical doctor such as yourself to know that if somebody feeling that they are getting choked, well, that would be a good reason why they would say they can't breathe.
Yes.
I wanted Dr. Fowler to see if you could just clear up a couple of things for me just in the timeline of what happened with respect to Mr. Floyd and restraint on the ground. Was the leg extension, the anoxic seizure as we've referred to it, was that before he lost consciousness or was it after he had lost consciousness?
After.
Okay. And did you make a note of when Mr. Floyd's, when was his last vocal sound? Do you remember?
Somewhere between a minute, 45 seconds and a minute before, I've got the information written down somewhere, before he went unconscious was about the last time that he actually vocalized.
If we focus in on the period of the subdual restraint and the neck compression, was there ever a time when, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, where you saw Mr. Floyd either sleepy, unarousable, or anything that's akin to being in a coma?
So from the period after he has those hypoxic seizures,
Or from the time he's first put on the ground, that he's pulled out of the car, Squad 320, he's subdued and restrained on the ground, Mr. Chauvin is on his neck and back. Did you ever see Mr. Floyd at any time manifest either sleepiness, a lack of awareness, that he wasn't arousable, or that sort of thing?
no, not until he lost consciousness.
And typically, doctor, when somebody passes away from a fentanyl or opioid overdose, one of the hallmarks of that is that they are very sleepy, and they will tend to be unarousable and pass away in essentially a coma, right?
Correct. If they are passing away from fentanyl overdose, that's what happens.
And Mr. Floyd was manifesting none of those outward symptoms, was he, on the ground?
Correct. It does not exclude the fact that it was still having a depressive effect on his respiratory system.
Well, before he lost consciousness, his respiration rate, I think you told us, that you agree with Dr. Tobin, was somewhere in the ballpark of 22 breaths a minute, right?
Correct.
That is normal, isn't it?
Yes.
If fentanyl was affecting his respiration, then you would expect a respiratory rate that would have been appreciably less than 22 breaths a minute if it's depressing his respiratory system, right?
Unless he should have been breathing at 30 at that particular stage because of his exertion and other stressors.
And you have no really basis or baseline to suggest that Mr. Floyd should have been breathing at 30 instead of the normal 22, right?
A person who is getting short of oxygen to their brain will often increase or usually increase their respiratory rate to more than 30.
I want to talk with you a bit about the methamphetamine. First, let me clear up, if I can, this issue of pills again in the car on May 25th. When Dr. Baker performed the autopsy, isn't it true that there weren't any pills found in Mr. Floyd's stomach?
Correct. Dr. Baker did not identify any pill, tablet, call you what you want, residue within the stomach.
And obviously, any pill that's found in a car is a pill that's not in Mr. Floyd's body.
Correct. Whatever the residual amount in those tablets was not in his body.
Now, I think you made a statement with respect to the methamphetamine that it was not accompanied by a metabolite commonly seen if the meth had been in the system for an appreciable period of time.
Yes.
And I want to kind of be clear on this. Have you, since making the statement in your report, learned that in fact the metabolite of methamphetamine, that is, amphetamine as the metabolite, was present in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream from the toxicology results?
I have heard a statement to that fact. Yes.
Did you investigate the statement to determine whether or not it was true?
Yes.
And did you find that contrary to what you had written in your report, you in fact found that the metabolite of methamphetamine was present from the toxicology results for Mr. Floyd?
In very low levels, so it did not change my opinion.
Well, the methamphetamine itself was only present in very low levels. Isn't that true?
That is true.
And so if there's not a lot of meth, then there won't be a lot of the metabolite either. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Correct. And or again, substantial amount of whatever methamphetamine is there has not yet been metabolized.
So what was the level of methamphetamine that was found in his toxicology results? Do you remember?
Not offhand, no.
How about 19 nanograms per milliliter? Does that sound right?
It sounded right. I did not want to say it because I did not want to be inaccurate.
Yeah. Thank you, doctor. 19 nanograms of methamphetamine is within the range of what you would see in a patient whose doctor prescribed a therapeutic dose of methamphetamine. True?
That is true if methamphetamine is used in a therapeutic environment.
Your Honor, could I have just 1 second? So last question, Dr. Fowler, then I will sit down for now. I wanted to, again, just address the timeline from your report. And I will read it to you, and my question would be whether or not this is the timeline that you stand behind, if I may. So at 8:24:09, the last audible vocal sounds identifiable as Mr. Floyd's are heard. Soon thereafter, voices from bystanders tell police he is not breathing. Mr. Floyd exhibits extension movements of right lower extremity at 8:24:21 and movements of his right arm at 8:24:33. At 8:25:16, Mr. Floyd appears to have passed out. So, representation from your report, is that your best knowledge and information, sir?
That's the information I extracted at that time. Yes.
And you stand by that too at this time, correct?
I have no reason to disagree with that at this time now.
Yeah. Dr. Fowler, thank you.
Nelson, should we break at this time, or can you be brief? Break?
Yeah.
All right,
Great.
break. We'll take our 20-minute break. Let's try and think about 10 after.